Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and you can support the channel on Subscribe Star Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. I am once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
This is our third episode of our political commentary series. We're going to see if we can make this work. Today's discussion is Anarcho-Terrorism. So, briefly, the news item that sort of inspired me to cover this was the August 27th shooting at the Church of Annunciation in Minneapolis, where a trans shooter killed 2 children and wounded 21 other people, and then committed suicide afterwards. And when last week, when we were planning for the next episode, Florian mentioned the idea of anarcho-terrorism, where you have these sort of like lone wolves or seemingly unassociated individuals committing acts of targeted terror. And I thought about that. And I decided to ask Grok. I said, Grok, okay, let's look at number of attacks on Catholic churches, schools, the whole Catholic-run institutions from 2020 to 2025. What's the number we see total number? It was like, let's see, Grok said it was about 500 because I looked at some Catholic website, came up on my X feed, which said that it was about 521 churches. It was from the Catholic Vote website. And Grok said it was broadly correct. So I said, okay, well, let's look at the 5 years before that, 2015 to 2020. And it said that there was something around 70, I think. So this is a large increase in attacks. And then I said, okay, Grok, let's look at the same 10 years and look at conservative institutions, Protestant institutions. Do we see a similar increase? And it said yes. And I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. So Catholics, Protestants, and conservatives have institutions and individuals being attacked this way. And they've really increased since 2020, so since COVID, right? And then the issue is our state and federal government's doing much about this. And the evidence was negligible. Now, the interesting thing here is you could look at this as a kind of targeted attack on conservatives and conservative institutions, and that the state and federal governments just aren't doing a whole lot about it. Now, that's one possible explanation. That would be like the worst case scenario. Another scenario presents itself that it's just negligence and incompetence. So, for example, we can see leftist victims of anarcho-terrorism, where a few years ago I remember there was a spat of leftist social media influencers who were defending the immigration that was going on, and we're all getting killed in the street by immigrants. And then the right had this huge explosion of Schadenfreude. And again, obviously, the immigration has not gone down. State and federal governments haven't done much about that either. And so I wonder to what extent this is just the government not being able to handle all of these things at once, rather than obviously some people are targeting conservative and Christian institutions, obviously. But, that seems to be the most parsimonious reading at this point, would just be that they're lone wolves. And that's sort of where I want to start this with. What are some of your thoughts, Florian?
Yeah, I always get two words, I always conflate them. So what I meant, and this still fits to this discussion, it was anarcho-tyranny, and that was a term that Sam Francis, paleoconservative, coined back I think he died around 2005. So it's an old phenomenon, or like an old framework. And yeah, one thing you said, that the state is just ineffective, is one of the criticisms against anarcho-tyranny. But what anarcho-tyranny actually says is that instead of the state enforcing the law to protect citizens from criminals, it basically applies law unequally, right? Harasses law-abiding citizens and basically lets criminals work without basically releases them back. I mean, even the immigration catch and release program is a little bit in that direction, right? Law-abiding citizens, they have to go through 10,000 controls and regulations. But if you are if you are an illegal immigrant or if you are like some common criminal, then yeah, you're not staying long in jail. You're basically letting out. And there are several examples of that. For example, how normal people are harassed. There was a lawsuit against the Sheetz convenience store company in 2024. They were alleged to discriminate against minorities because they filtered out job applicants with a criminal background. And since then, you got more minority, the ones, there were, the percentage of minorities that were rejected because of a criminal background check was higher than the percentage of non-minorities, of white people and others. That percentage was lower. They were basically passing criminal background checks more often. Then the government decided that they were discriminating against minorities and launched a lawsuit against them. Ironically, that happened while Joe Biden did a campaign stop in 2024 in one of the Sheetz convenience stores in Pennsylvania. That is one example. Another example is the city of San Francisco can discriminate against homeless or vagrants. They can't clear out homeless encampments. There was a small town ruling before in Boise where you have a few dozen homeless, and that ruling said Boise is not allowed to clear out those homeless. And the next court applied it to San Francisco. So when the some homeless organization sued the city of San Francisco for wanting to clean out the homeless encampments, they were basically blocked by a court of law. And in a way, and we can get to that further, as one point behind these legal harassments are certain organizations here, in this case for San Francisco, the homelessness organizations that often manage the problem of homelessness, and it makes them money, right? They're not interested in solving the problem. They're interested in keeping people homeless because then they get more money to find solutions to the crisis, right? So that could be one reason behind this court order, which is complete nonsensical that a city doesn't have the right to clean up homeless encampments. And what happens then is, if you have like almost all neighborhoods in San Francisco, some 10 cities there, yeah, normal people are going to get harassed, or there's going to be petty theft when they pass by. They may step into a drug needle if they're unlucky, or it's just a public nuisance. You see homeless people having sex in the open, which sounds hilarious, but if you have to look at that all the time, it's not so hilarious anymore, right? And another example are the vaccination campaigns and lockdowns, and people weren't allowed to go to church anymore, which ties back into the church topic. That wasn't allowed, and I still know there was one like little video where they had like a funeral, and so two of the relatives were all sitting in sort of distance in that room in a funeral home, and the casket was in front of them, and then like two of them wanted to go. The two of the relatives wanted to get closer to one another, and then like some bouncer came and shoved them outside again, right? How pointless, but COVID protocols, 6 feet distancing, social distancing had to be obeyed. Well, when George Floyd died and they were all gathering around his coffin, that wasn't a problem anymore. Then everyone could actually get together, right? The BLM riots all of a sudden were deemed, that was racism is a bigger problem than COVID even. That's a bigger crisis, so we have to allow anti-racism protests, right? That's anarcho-tyranny in action right there. And in general, it's an allowance for chaos to proceed. And areas where people could normally gather peacefully are heavily policed. That's like Solzhenitsyn wrote that in Soviet Russia in the beginning, the thieves were allowed to have a knife because that was his nature, right? He's a thief, he has a knife. But normal citizens, if you are caught with a knife or another weapon, hell no, you go into jail, right? So that's how the state enforced crime or enforced its power in an unequal manner. And the theory here behind that is that that the bureaucracy is basically one way in which they increase their power. Instead of like using their power to protect citizens from crime, they use their power to increase their reach, right? More bureaucracy, more rules, and they can go down on law-abiding people in their little shop, and oh, let's stop. Oh, you didn't obey to that rule. We give you a big fine, and too bad when your business is bankrupted by that fine. We don't care, and that's a way for the managerial state to actually increase its reach. And that's one of the problems with anarcho-tyranny, that it's a tool of statecraft, if you will, right? And so that's behind the. I think that was one of Sam Francis's thesis why anarcho-tyranny exists. So it's more than just an ineffective state, although that plays a role too. It is more a targeted program that the state uses to increase its power.
Yeah. Another example of this sort of like punishment of private persons was the Marka Petrushka McCloskey incident from June 28th, 2020, where they have the picture with an AR-15 and a pistol while they're surrounded by George Floyd protesters. And, nobody fired any guns, but they were, prosecuted for brandishing the weapons. And so a lot of right-wingers were like, well, look at this. See, there we go. But there is an interesting, also unsettling possibility that at least some element of the political apparatus are actively cultivating these violent chaos. Caleb Maupin, who I've had on before, he wrote a book recently, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of American Years of Lead. He sort of argues that he's been arguing that certain elements, of the security state are trying to stimulate violence in order to make it horizontal rather than vertical. Vertical violence would be from the bottom up, and they don't want that because they want to stay in charge. And so that pent up energy, that libidinal release, they're trying to channel it vertically, so people just take each other out. And there is some evidence that this has been going on for a long time. The idea of having these mentally unstable people used as cat's paws. I mean, there was the shoe bomber, the Muslim shoe bomber. In fact, a lot of the terror attacks, small scale terror attacks, done by Muslims. And I think in 2015 there was an Egyptian couple in California. A lot of it was weird, like, and then you hear like stuff about handlers. I remember there was the hit by that white nationalist guy in a Sikh temple a few years back. And then there was some weird, connection with like Discord and his handlers. So whether it's like, I don't know, white, and then there was the guy with the Catholic church, the Catholic school shooting, was in his like manifesto, basically was saying that he's a neo-Nazi transgender person. And Cenk Uygur on X was like, what the heck is even that? I don't even know. And so a lot of this stuff just is weird. And there's these weird connections to like handlers on Discord. And also we have, and we see this more and more with even like the trans shooters. So there's the three basic types that they trot out. There's Islamic, there's white guys, and there's trans. And these seem to be like the three types of lone wolf attacks that we've seen over the last 20 years. And or in this case, 25. I mentioned the shoe bomber. And I think part of this is to again, stimulate this sort of horizontal conflict rather than vertical, because they don't want, the bottom to rise up against them. Now, does that mean that everybody in the political system knows this and everybody in the No, of course not. This is like deep undercover spook stuff. This could be something that cooked up on the CIA. Who knows, right? And so what I think is interesting about this as a phenomena and looking at the impact that we have two basic pressures at work here. There's the broader system, of techno capital, which wants to have immigrants coming in to decrease the cost of labor, that wants to have a society in which nobody lays hands on each other. So, right, the idea of like, except if it's a criminal trying to attack you, in which case that's fine. But otherwise, that's and nobody's actually morally evil, except of course white Christian men. And so you have to understand and cure the criminal, right, and treat the criminal rather than prosecute the criminal, right? And so a lot of catch and release laws in these blue states are like that, right? So that's just part of the machinery of society working in a way that's not to the benefit of the people that live in it. Now that's partly just how it's been built, and that may or may not be the result of a conspiracy. But then there are elements which do seem to be conspiratorial, where you have individuals which seem to be groomed or mentally unstable or manipulated to do certain things, and they come from a wide variety of backgrounds. And I think there's this push-pull dynamic between these two forces.
Yes, and it's I'm reminded when you talk about the attempts to therapy criminals are that reminds me of the moniker of the therapeutic state, which is very much like if you look at all like a healthcare, social services industry where you have like a strong prevalence of uh, of liberal white women, basically, an HR department and that kind of stuff. Um, those will be very welcoming to ideas of therapy, right? So they will basically not be in favor of using law enforcement to quell criminal unrest. They will want to have law enforcement maybe pick up the criminals, but then release them into a mental institution if need be, right? Otherwise, we try to understand the criminal. He had a bad childhood. He comes from poverty and so on. If you can't do it, though, if that guy is a raving lunatic or just like a criminal monster, serial killer, they will still want to put him into a mental institution. And at the same time, the state will also want to put, and that was what the Stalinist state did in other communist states. They sometimes declared political enemies as insane, right? Which basically they put in an insane asylum, and that shuts them up for good. Because if the wardens don't want, nobody escapes the insane asylum, and it's basically a lifelong prison sentence without any court of law involved, right? And I see that tendency a little bit by the idea to apply therapy to cure crime or criminal tendencies if they were a disease. And that actually I would say that's a silent power grab by the state, because they don't need to go through the judicial system anymore. They can just put whoever they want into a mental asylum, right? And then basically you're in there, you have no chance of getting out. And even if you probably get insane by just being in insane asylum. Um, and and But what you said with horizontal terror is also very interesting, because it always turns out that these school shooters, then like the FBI or the CIA, they knew about them, and they visited the school shooters several times, and then who could have known the guy was actually following through with his threats and shooting up a school? Or if we remember the Pulse nightclub shooter in 2016, the guy who shot a gay bar or gay nightclub up, the father of the guy was actually a CIA informant. So there's some weird connections there, and I don't know whether I mentioned that before, but Rouge talked about that in when he gave a talk. He said that basically the police can immediately see what your deal is, right? They stop you in the street because you have a broken tail light, and then they type in the license plate number, and they see exactly are you a search criminal, are there warrants out against you, or any other information. Of course, it's easy to imagine that maybe they have a little yellow flag category like potentially crazy, let him go or something, right? So that the CIA, and that goes back to MK Ultra, that the CIA may still, or government agencies may still have their little pet crazy people around that they activate if need be, right? And you really start to think, because those people that you said, all these lone wolves, many of them are basically crazy and unstable, and they're just waiting to explode if they just triggered a little bit. And we remember maybe this plot against Gretchen Whitmer to kidnap her, something like that, in Michigan. And it turns out that the entire group of supposed white nationalists that wanted to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, like 80% of them, were all CIA informants. So basically what they did was they looked at some hapless white guy in his basement, basically, literally. And then they egged him on until he said, okay, I'm going to do it. And then they nail him. The same way, by the way, that Ruby Ridge happened, right? They had the guy, I forgot his name, but he lived there and wanted to be left in peace. And apologies if I garble the story here, but basically they had an FBI informant go in and egg him on until he procured a sawed-off shotgun, and then they could they could catch him. They thought, and that all developed into a standoff. But that's nothing new. And also, I think it hits both sides. It more often hits the right-wing side since a couple of decades, but it can still also hit left-wing Antifa types. Like there was a terrorist cell, Antifa terrorist cell that they were egged on to bomb a bridge in Pennsylvania. That was the same mechanism. There were undercover FBI feds that basically egged people on, and then they caught them. It's a very cheap way, because sometimes these people need a lot of egging on until they become active, and then the law takes them in if they want to make some political point or show that they're still there and care for the security of the people, which is complete bullshit, right? So it rings true. It rings true what you said. By the way, though, sometimes the horizontal violence gets out of control. Like Luigi would be a clear vertical violence example, right? So he shot one healthcare CEO, and Timothy McVeigh would be another example of someone who applied vertical violence, right, against the ruling class. That was the guy who bombed the entire FBI building in Oklahoma. And that's probably a dilemma of the state. They need to, if they want to foment unrest, they have to be careful that it's not blowing back on themselves.
Yes. Now, to unpack this a little bit further, I like how you talked about the idea of egging on these either agents or unstable people. One of the things that the left likes to talk about, and this is actually a thing that cuts both ways, is stochastic terrorism, which is the use of incendiary language to provoke acts of violence with plausible deniability. So in the Middle Ages, one of the things that kings would do is they would marry for political reasons, but they would also marry close blood relatives, which is called consanguinity, which is, guess what, grounds for an annulment if you want one. So they play this little game where they make political alliances, they marry close blood relatives, but then if it doesn't work out, they can ask the Catholic Church for an annulment, and depending on the case, they could probably get granted one. Henry VIII didn't, but that's different. Then you can just do it again, right? So you create a system with this built-in tension where you can then manipulate it and use it the way you want, right? And so whether it's people that you control and handle or just generally unstable people, right, you can have these stochastic terrorist presentations where voices on the right or voices on the left. And again, if we want to go down the whole route of the synthetic left with Caleb Maupin and their connection to intelligence agencies, and then also, there's a lot you could do. There's elements of spooks on both sides, and they can sort of turn up the amplifier and just blast, provocative content, which can either A, trigger unstable people, or B, can serve as like a smokescreen for the actual handlers to send out and program the individual. And so, but you're right. Sometimes it's not horizontal. It's not of horizontal violence. It's vertical violence. Like, again, most famously, the Oklahoma City bomber. But I think ultimately, though, that's considered acceptable collateral damage. I think that's what they'd say. That's how they think, right? So they'd probably say it's acceptable collateral damage. So all of this is to try to like see part of the problem is that techno capital hides social relations. So the way the actual real relations between people are hidden. And these attacks and these actions seem completely uncaused. They just seem to pop out of the void. And it creates a sense of fear, a sense of, I don't know, am I going to walk down the street and then, blam, some unstable person waves an AR-15 in my face or brandishes a knife? Unlikely, but it creates that impression, right? And so part of this too is that it creates a culture of fear where people are afraid of what is going on, and they take proactive measures that actually don't address the real issue because they're not aware of the hidden social relations. And what I hope today's episode does is starts to at least peek behind the curtain and see from what evidence we do know, what these social relations might look like. Florian.
Yeah, I think when you think about it, then if you compare anarcho-terrorism or anarcho-tyranny to classical tyranny, you have some differences, right? For example, in classical tyranny, like you may have harsh laws, but they apply to everyone equally, right? All are subject to the dictator's wrath, right? In ancient Rome, or even with Stalin after he was in power, although he still used an element of anarcho-tyranny via his NKVD, which was a secret service that basically and the random purges, which of Stalin just had random purges of people in his administration, his bureaucracy, and basically created a climate of fear to keep everyone in line. And nobody knew who it could be. It could be a best friend of Stalin who gets killed, or it could be someone who always hated Stalin and said so openly, and he was getting by with it unscathed. So, but in general, Stalinist Russia was more of a tyranny against everyone, like more of a classical tyranny. And in anarcho-tyranny, laws are applied asymmetrically, and that means like tolerated disorder for some and strict penalties for other. And the problem with that is that cannot completely be in the interest of the classical ruling class. It's basically a policy of the managerial class running amok, right? Basically, they try. Basically, anarcho-tyranny is basically kind of a power grab of the managerial class, and so for them it's also easy to accept that there's some collateral damage, because Luigi will not kill some mid-management guy. Luigi will go for the CEO, go for the owners, maybe even, right? For the C-suite, but not for some middle managers. And I think one of the reasons for that might be that overall the past tyrannies and totalitarian states and world wars, there's one group of people that always got away unscathed, relatively unscathed, and those are the managerial guys. You had the managers the people that managed Nazi Germany. Some of them were put back into power. They had to undergo some denazification workshop or whatever, and then the Allied put them back into place, or some were scooped up by the GDR and were then probably part of the Stasi and stuff like that. And also all the anti-Nazi Nuremberg trials from 45 to 55. There were some judges that had to answer for their judgment in front of a court of law, but most of them got by unscathed. So the judiciary and the bureaucracy, they are usually getting by, however cruel the state is. Once it's over, they are going to be fine. And while the state is going on, they still have a privileged position. And so I think from that point, the managerial kind of people have started to see themselves as their own class and try to push through their interests. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have anarcho-tyranny. It's a power grab by the managerial class.
So, I'm going to tie together some stuff we've been working on, Florian, with our programming. There's a saying amongst the right, a thing is what a thing does. So if we look at the trans shooters, And they seem to be in the news lately, and they've been in the news. They probably will continue to be in the news. What I see them as is they're a loitering munition. They're like the Switchblade drone, and their handlers are the operators of the drone. And so they're not meant to walk away, right? In the cases that I mentioned, Nashville and Minneapolis, they both took their own lives. In that regard, what we see is this is a loitering munition. This thing is just kind of hovering around, not really active yet, or a sleeper cell, to use like a terrorist term or an insurgent term, and then you need to activate that sleeper cell, right? So, but now I think we're using a drone analogy, and this kind of loiters around, and then whatever the trigger is, like a Manchurian Candidate, right? They do it, right? And why is this so effective? Well, one of the reasons why it's effective is because obviously we can talk about the handlers, but let's not talk about them. We don't really know who they are. They're very cloak and dagger spook stuff. But the people that actually do this, specifically the trans shooters, there's a sense in which, through being both terminally online and having gone through a great amount of personal pain, have achieved a higher level of consciousness in the people around them. So what this does is it gives them kind of a first mover advantage, because both, right, the two extremes of pain and pleasure can both expand your consciousness. And, Hollywood has done this a lot with films, people that go through, torment turn into monsters, and people that go through pleasure turn into something else, right? We see this, right? So whatever their individual backstories are, which we don't really know, what we can say from the behavior and the characters of these individuals is that they have gone through some painful experiences, which are simultaneously mind expanding and consciousness expanding, as well as marring and twisting, right? So it's sort of like you have the conservatives, the Catholic school, the Presbyterian school. They were like France in World War II, and they have this Ardennes pocket that they think is impenetrable. They don't really have defenses there. And the German Panzer Division comes in through the Ardennes and it rolls the whole thing up. And that's sort of what these trans shooters are doing. And that's because they and their handlers have a higher level of consciousness in a narrow area, right? But it's enough to find that chink in the armor, that people who maybe are older, not as tech savvy, not as up to date on where techno capital is, are likely to not be prepared for. And I think all of this is a sort of like descriptive account of what is happening and what is going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So basically, they are more on edge because they are, or they're more sensitive to changes in the environment because they are on a higher level of consciousness.
Well, no, what I'm saying is the obviously the children, but like the victims of these attacks, right? They don't have the same level of consciousness. It's a lower level. So think of it kind of like this, right? So in the video game Red Alert, you could have a spy that would infiltrate enemy buildings and do things. But if the player had attack dogs, they could then sense the spy and attack them. But other units couldn't. Other units could not detect the spy except the attack dog. And so basically, it's sort of like, unless you have that right detector unit there, this stealth unit, the stealth assassin, if you will, can just sneak right in and cause havoc, right? And that is a video game terminology to represent the higher level of consciousness.
Okay, yeah, so the operators, they are supposed to know when supposed to be able to stop them before they do some reckless act, and not stop them if a reckless act is preferred.
Well, the targets just can't detect it. That's the point I'm getting at. They just don't have the right detective unit to reveal the stealth.
Yeah, but sometimes the handlers also don't detect them well enough, and then those guys go on a rampage.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that. I mean, I think those all those guys. I mean, why is the FBI showing up 2 or 3 times by the what's the name, Marjorie Westman Douglas School in Florida? That guy, the FBI knew what he was, and they just released him again, or they asked some questions, and then they went back, and all of a sudden the guy shoots up the school. It's probably just they they couldn't contain their little attack dog in that point, and they thought that guy would be their attack dog, and they basically weren't able to handle him. It's a dangerous game, and probably the handlers who think themselves of higher consciousness, they are also a little incompetent, right? Maybe there's some Dunning-Kruger effect at work. Yeah.
Well, the other thing too here is if we look at what would be so we can look at the effect of the Nashville and Minneapolis attacks, though they're separated by 2 years. One's Protestant, one's Catholic. The victims were primarily children, though I think in Nashville 2 adults were killed as well. What I think is important to understand here is I do not believe that the actual people that were killed were the ultimate target. I believe they were a means to an end to incite terror, to incite fear, right? And so by a public display of some gruesome action, you can incite fear in millions of people because it's going to go on the TV. And I think that effect of fear that freezes people in place or stimulates thoughtless, violent reaction from the victim group is what they want.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes they use a top-down way to implement these things. For example, someone like the new Pope Leo the 13th. Anyway, that guy, he is agitated for gun control. He thinks that's tragic. Americans are allowed to have guns, and COVID vaccination he calls it an act of love. Someone like the Pope has a lot of influence on Catholics, right? But he talks like a deep state stooge. He doesn't address like trans terror against. He doesn't directly address these acts of terror against his own church or his own institutions. He basically pours oil onto the fire, right? He basically advocates for the entire globalism lie and everything, and basically he leaves his own institutions, he leaves them open to attack. And I think that's an example how institutions directly actively foment the problem. I would say he is part of the problem when it comes to anarcho-tyranny, right? Because he basically encouraged people to not do anything against it. Just let the government do. Just keep cowering down. Don't do anything, and just believe in the goodness of people. And that's a very foolish recommendation he gives overall. But that has a lot of sway, I imagine, with Catholics, still even in the U.S. still.
So to sort of double back here on the thing about consciousness here. So one of the things that I've been talking about both on X and on YouTube here is that if we look at the woke and the leftists and all of these different, political projects that they've been pushing, they can sort of be analyzed and treated as psychological warfare operations. And I've got some engagement from AA talking about the woke being a psychological warfare operation. The thing is, what is the weak point? What is the vector of entry into these conservative or Christian places, mentally speaking, where they have this mental block, or they can't you can't protect what you don't see coming, right? That's the thing. You can't protect yourself from what you don't see coming. The question is, what is it about the consciousness of these conservative Americans, conservative Christian Americans, that they can't see this coming? Whatever that is the vector of entry. And whoever these people are going to keep running that play again and again and again, like a Hail Mary that no one can block. Because so far it hasn't been blocked yet. I mean, why would you, right? If that's your game, then you're going to keep playing that game until you either get new orders or you completely rout your opposition, right? That's sort of how we're going. And I would offer that part of this mental blindness, part of this vector of entry, is that on the one hand, there is this disgust against the transgender outlook, but they can't comprehend how it can exist. Now here's the thing, right? Technology has made a lot of things possible that in prior ages was not possible. You could only imagine it. You couldn't see it. You couldn't even create the simulation of it. It just was not possible at all. And then, you have technology which allows things, at least in theory, that people think are now possible. And so what I would argue here is that the skill gap in consciousness is that there are certain aspects of how techno-capital works that allows individuals to think that they are some sex other than they are. And that's a complex set of interconnecting pieces. But because conservatives don't fully appreciate that creates a mental blind spot. Okay, can it really happen in the cosmic ontological sense? No. But that's not the point, okay? It's something in between the cosmic reality and where we're living now. This is happening. And that gap, that window is wide open, whatever it is, right? And they just keep running that play.
Yeah, in general, I would also suggest that everyone that you should think twice which kind of text you want to read, or which kind of propaganda you want to subject yourself to, because once you internalize certain words, they become part of your own personality without you necessarily realizing. I'm not saying don't read propaganda or not, but be aware what it is, right? And don't let it affect you too much. I would say, talking about propaganda, that's one of the normal vehicles. Why do I think that? Because like several people said, when you went through the more rural areas of America, that the deep red states during COVID, like they all very, very faithfully wore masks. We can laugh about liberals like getting like all crazy with the eyes and the mask, right? But it's the truth that also red state conservatives obeyed the law, because that's what they want. They're good people. They want to be aligning with something, right? And then Fox News will not do them any favors here. And if you think about it, and I read that like that's not officially confirmed, but I think Cernovich mentioned that, and I believe he's right. I have no reason to doubt him. It's also very plausible. What he said was that one of the executives at Fox News has a transgender kid. And so nobody in the Fox News programming environment, the people that make the shows and everything, they will not criticize the transgender ideology, right? Things like that can also happen, like whether it's by coincidence or whether it's targeted. Institutions or like media institutions get also internally captured by certain ideologies without anyone even have to say a word. If the person, and I don't know who it is, but just imagine you have a person in HR who has a transgender kid, and are you really going to write a segment that goes on air where you criticize transgenderism? No, not if you want to keep your job. Then we'll circumscribe it, maybe, but you will probably not even mentioning it, right? And so then people don't see what the danger is. That would be one example, like captured media institutions, in addition to media institutions launching propaganda, and to lull people into a false complacency.
Yeah. Another way to frame the skill gap, or the sort of like entry point that the conservatives are not really preparing for, is I want to go back to the example again of the Nashville shooting in 2023. So this woman, Audrey Elizabeth Hale, then says she's a trans man, blah blah blah. But if you read her manifesto, she grew up in that school with those people and hated them, and that hate is what fueled her actions. Now, this isn't to say whether or not that hate was justified, but the point is, these people couldn't believe that they had generated such a level of hate in one of their own. Right, there's that old African proverb, the boy will burn down the village to feel the warmth of the fires if he doesn't feel the warmth of the village's love. That kind of principle is just not even on anybody's radar. It's like, why would anybody do this? Well, I mean, there's that African proverb that might help you figure out why somebody might do that, right? And the other thing is, they would in my experience, right, the conservative is going to just tend to say, well, look, you don't matter, your opinion doesn't matter. And the person that becomes trans, right? Because you don't start that way, you become that way. And then how do you become that way? Well, there's a whole bunch of ways, but that's not the point right now. The point is, this is a person that wants to be heard, right? And if you constantly don't get heard, you're just going to be like, fine. You know what? You know what you can't ignore? You know what you can't do? An act of violence. An act of violence cannot be ignored, and an act of violence will be heard. And so I think, to use liberal terminology, a culture of suppressing voices is part of this blind spot that is creating the opening that is being exploited for these targeted attacks.
Yeah, and that's especially true. That's especially true for the conservative side, maybe also for some liberals. But people who are, and the perfidious thing about it is people who are especially friendly and want to do the right thing, they may become victims, because they may actually be lulled into a sense of they want to please everyone, and they never imagine that their hospitality could be abused, right? And it's also, for example, look at the recent action of the Trump administration destroying the boat smuggling drugs. Okay, you can criticize it and you can think it's a good idea. It certainly has a signaling effect on other drug smugglers and so on. But what then some politicians do is they say, "Oh, we should have reeled those smugglers in, and the police should take over them," and that is part of this kind of propaganda, this kind of statements. They basically serve to make people more docile. They basically say, "Oh yeah, we shouldn't. There's no problem, and we can police our way out of this, and we don't need to have those drastic measures, and Trump is not a tyrant," and so on. And basically, while you could agree with some of these points, what all these statements do is basically making people more compliant and trusting that that the law is doing something, when the law is in many cases the one that actually screws them over, right? But they still trust it, right? They're still reminded that they have to trust the legal process. And you can look at all the National Review conservatives, right? They basically also say, "Oh, Trump is beyond the pale, and we're not like that, and oh, he does icky things, or he says he grabs women by the pussy," and so on, and don't realizing that sometimes you need to fight a little bit against the institutions, and instead of trusting them, right? And then and that's unfortunate. That's also one reason why people are not recognizing the danger that's coming to them, because people tell them everything is fine. Yes, some crime is over there, but it's all going to be taken care of. You are secure, right? And that is an overall propaganda that lulls people to sleep, and makes them basically makes criminals unaccountable, and makes people stop being vigilant.
Yeah. Now, also to put the shoe on the other foot of this anarcho-terrorism angle, if you look at, let's say, a far right shooter, like say the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, whose manifesto talked about the Great Replacement and white genocide, so that was 2019. It may not just be the voice of the suppressed actor. It might also be the suppressed actor wanting to express, right, some core issue that they think is important that nobody's talking about, right? And so it's not necessarily a silencing of the individual. It's a silencing of factors in society that negatively affect the individual, right? And they're like, well, fine, you can't ignore my manifesto now if I use violence. In fact, that's exactly what the Unabomber said. Ted Kaczynski says at the end, you guys wouldn't be reading this if I didn't send bombs. And so the part of the problem here is we've created an environmental system in which two things are occurring. Certain individuals, or for whatever reason, are having their voices muffled in the social context. And then, second of all, there are issues that these individuals believe affect them disproportionately and negatively that they can only draw attention to by an act of violence. So I think that, and that could be left wing or right wing, right? This is just anarcho-terrorism. It's both sides. Because again, I don't want to say it's only the handlers. I mean, they're definitely a part of it, but these people still act on their own volition at some level, right? So that's the other thing I'd say.
Yeah, we can also, in that case, we can also go, and I find it also a tendency that's not often discussed, but I find it also a problem that violence is discouraged. Violence is seen as like horrible, we must never allow it, and must always be peaceful. And I agree, society should work peaceful, and in many cases will work peaceful, right? There are unwritten law that people follow and so on. But violence is a tool, and I think violence is a legitimate tool. It just needs to be used in a proper context. But if you make yourself, if you ignore that violence can be part of the solution for some people, maybe not for you, but there are people who think violence is a solution. If you ignore violence as a societal tool, if you shrink away from violence and just don't want to have anything to do with you, well, then you will always be a victim of people that use violence, right? And I think like these zero tolerance policies in schools, for example, some kids, the only way they can achieve a higher status is by display of physical dominance. That is just the case, right? Why would you have kids not allowed to engage in that? Yeah, you don't want the bullies like beat down on the weaker kids, but maybe you could teach the weaker kids that it's okay if they hit the bully back, right? And there are examples in schools where some kid was bullied, but the bully was left out, and the kid was punished, right? Go back to Britain right now. You have some gentlemen of the non-UK persuasion attacking two girls, and the girl pulled out like an axe and a knife, and the girl was taken to custody, right? There was another short image I saw, short video I saw of an 11-year-old boy who was draping himself into the Union Jack flag in Britain, and the police harassed him, and I don't know whether they took him in custody, but they surrounded him and they didn't allow him to wear his flag or something. They basically harassed him for doing something, and the real bullies that were out there that were actually using violence to get their point through. Yeah, you have Muslim rape gangs and all these other criminals, because the police doesn't dare do anything against them, and the people are lulled into compliance because violence is abhorrent. We can't engage in that. Well, maybe you should, right? And if you take violence away from people as a tool, if you disallow ordinary citizens to use it, well, then it's also a power grab, because those people will be subjected to your violence by the police, right? You can control them. They will never even have the idea to strike back.
So, yeah, I think it's about time to wrap up. But I would say that the main point that I've been trying to get at here is this: is that these whether it's anarcho-terrorism or, yeah, you were right. You did say last week anarcho-tyranny, but this does kind of fit with it too, though. So there is some sort of gap, chink in the armor of these conservatives in the way that they think, such that they are left vulnerable to these plays. Now, I have some ideas as to what some of that might be, but a lot of times, a perfect example right now, granted, I don't know of any case like this, but we all know examples of, say, like a overbearing father who claims he knows what his son or daughter is doing or thinking, but they just don't tell him because he's so overbearing. They just kind of stew on it, right? And then when it happens, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was coming. Well, it's patently obvious to anybody who wasn't up his own backside that if you were doing this to your kids, they're not going to tell you when they finally go off. Well, that's your blind spot right there. You know what I mean? That's just one example that you could multiply out people need to start figuring out where their blind spots are conceptually, behaviorally, and start practicing better security measures. Florian.
Yeah, very interesting. I reminded, and I'm trying to find it. Maybe I find it and I send it. But Master Chim is the moniker of Justin Garcia, and he ran the original Pressure Project, and that was a podcast, a community for people that were into MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And he brought out a list with daily situations where you should have thought about, where you should think about what we do in a situation. Like, for example, it was kind of hilarious. Like, you could combine, I'm in the dark alley, I'm standing in front of my door, I'm at the gas station, and then the other event was all of a sudden a bullet is in your leg or something like that. Or two strangers accost you and ask you for the way. And these kind of things, I think it's important to think about these situations because they can arise. And if you really think about them, you are much more aware of how vulnerable you really are, right? And that is probably also true for the political view. And the other thing is that I think what you see many conservatives, National Review-like conservatives that we called conservatives back then, a nicer moniker is peacetime conservatives, right? We can't use peacetime conservatives right now. The situation that we are in calls for wartime conservatives. And so maybe that's the optimistic message I can give out here. I think that there's going to be more wartime conservatives that are more belligerent coming up. And so that makes our situation better on the long run because those are the conservatives we need right now. It takes time until you have a turnover until you switch from peacetime to wartime. But I think in 5-10 years we'll see a much more belligerent nature of conservatives. I mean, one example, 5 years ago, people were telling you mass deportations are never possible. And now everyone talks about we need mass deportation. Some people Elon Musk talked about we need remigration, which was almost a fatal word if you use that. If European identitarian used the word remigration, that was almost killing them, this word, because they were prosecuted because of that. And now people just start using that word. So the society is shifting, and I think we're getting into more wartime conservatism in the next 5 to 10 years.
All right. Thank you, Florian. This is Todd Lewis.
Thank you for having me.
Of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.